Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today I got Mooch.
Hey, what's up, man?
How you doing?
Good. Happy to be back on.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Yeah, you have a crazy story, and we're going to get into some of the tales that you've been in, some of the craziness. One of the first things I want to ask you is, I know that you were hanging out with like the skinhead types when you were younger, right? What
Right.
was your first introduction to the one percenter lifestyle?
My dad grew up kind of around the local club, which was the Gypsy Jokers in Oregon. So, my dad had friends that would come over and stuff. My dad was out riding around quite a bit. So probably from a really, really young age, I would see it. I just didn't know much about it. And then as I got older in that punk rock and skinhead, kind of movement, a lot more people in that area were kind of graduating out of that into motorcycle clubs. So there was a lot of overlaps. A lot of the homies from FSU were going into the Outlaws, and most hated and the dudes from NorCal were hanging out the Angels and East Bay Rats. And so there was starting to be kind of like, it was starting to be more prevalent in my world. And I was starting to see more of it.
And was there a big divide because these people are going with different clubs?
I didn't know enough about the political side of it back then, really. It was more kind of regional. So like, the FSU dudes were in Boston and upstate, and that's, the Outlaws where I was at in that area. And that's where they went. And before they went to clubs, we were all friends, right? We all came from the same scene. We did a lot of things together, toured a lot together, played music together. So it was kind of more regional. It kind of just depended on like who was in what area. Usually it was like one guy from that group went and joined whatever dominant club was there, and then his friends followed. So it really wasn't divided yet because we didn't know a lot about the politics or the who was who.
And you were in Oregon, right?
Yeah.
At first.
Yep. Yeah.
So what was your first introduction to the Vagos?
Vagos I met when I was in Nevada. So the first club I met in Oregon was the Outsiders. That was a club that I first hung around with and prospected for a little bit. And they were a club that's been in Portland since the 60s. They've been there forever, and they're a very old school chopper club. And one of the guys was working at the local Harley dealership when I bought my first bike. So he worked at the parts counter. I'd go up there and buy parts for my bike, and we'd shoot the shit. And he ended up inviting me out to start hanging around. And, I was really excited to do that because, I was just getting into riding. But same thing with like Gang World or anything else. Once I was in, I was all in. So when I started riding, I was super interested in motorcycle clubs. I just didn't know enough, much about it. So it took a chance to meet one, and he invited me out, and I started going to their clubhouse and their events and on their rides, and learned a lot that way. But eventually ended up moving to Nevada for work. And so I left the Outsiders.
But you were prospecting, right? For them first?
Yeah, I was prospecting.
How long were you?
It was only about 2 months. They were really cool. Because I was leaving for work, they said, hey, you can leave. And if you come back, you can pick up where you left off. Because, they didn't have a lot of younger guys at the time. And I think that, they were kind of excited about having some younger guys around. I was from that local scene, so I probably could have brought more people with me potentially. So it didn't really burn any bridges at the time that, they say, if you come back, you can pick up where you left off. But while I was down in Nevada, they actually introduced me with some other clubs out in that area. So I was kind of riding around, just meeting different clubs, hanging out with different people. But that's when I met the Vagos. The Vagos were the first club I had seen that had younger guys in it. A lot of guys from the punk rock scene. Like the Outlaws and stuff. Like I said, some guys from FSU joined the Outlaws, but that was all the way out on the East Coast. Like I didn't see that firsthand where I was at. So all the clubs in Oregon were really old school. So it was that traditional kind of biker look, and that there hadn't been much overlap yet. So when I met the Vagos, there was these dudes that were, in a punk rock and skateboarding, and it really connected with me. I really resonated with all of that. So I jumped in head first with those guys and really started hanging around a ton and spending a lot of time with them.
Was there a process because you were prospecting for the other club? Was there a process to go and start prospecting for the Vagos?
Yeah, I think normally I would have prospected for the Vagos, but the chapter I was hanging out with was splitting in two, and they were starting a new chapter. And so I was kind of brought in as a charter member. So I still came in as a probationary member. On paper, I think it was a patch for patch, even though I didn't technically have one with the other club. But I came in and chartered a new chapter, so I didn't end up prospecting.
Wow, you landed into all these roles at a perfect timing, huh?
Yeah, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened if timing wasn't right? Like, like I said, when it came to joining the Vagos, eventually when it came to joining the Mongols, stuff like that, it just happened to be the right time at the right place, really, or knowing the right people.
So did you have any dealings with law enforcement when you were with the Vagos?
Not a ton. I had a lot growing up, in that skinhead scene and stuff. I got my first felony assault charge at 16. I got my adult felony assault charge right after turning 18. I had about 6 misdemeanor assault charges by the time I'd moved to Nevada. So, I Ed's probably spent, almost 10 years on probation already, from juvenile and then to adult probation. So I had a lot of experience with law enforcement already. And so I kind of already had my mind made up about how that was going to go. But honestly, as a Vagos, not until I moved back to Oregon. When I moved back to Oregon, I was still a Vago. And I was assigned to the Southern Oregon chapter, which is South Valley chapter Vagos. But I lived up in the Central Valley, so I was almost 3 hours away. And so because I was wearing a patch in an area where they weren't used to us and we weren't normally there, then yeah, that gathered a lot of law enforcement attention. And that's when they started sending informants after us and stuff like that, because they were trying to figure out what we were doing and why we were there.
How many people did you guys have once you went back up to Oregon?
There was always two chapters there was already two chapters of Vagos in Oregon before I came back there. So it was South Valley and North Valley. When I moved home to Eugene and then Salem, which is where I'm from. And there was just me and my twin brother. Some guys would travel through and stuff, but we were attached to the Southern Oregon chapter, and we just have to travel back and forth for church every weekend. So we weren't really trying to start a chapter at the time. We weren't in a position to start a chapter. We were brand new members. So we were just kind of up there hanging out. But anything we did club related, pretty much we'd have to go right down south and spend time with the chapter down in Southern Oregon.
Now, for the people that don't know, like, what's the process if you want to travel across the country and you have your patch? Do you have to let other people know that you're going to ride through the territory?
Yeah, I mean, every club's a little different, but for most club, and especially, when you're getting along with other clubs and just out of respect, you usually would call whoever the dominant club in that territory is and let them know that you were passing through, or whether you were staying or whether you were just passing through on the way to work, or, whatever. But that courtesy heads up would go a long way. And a lot of times that would happen.
No, would they ever say, no, you can't come through here with your patches?
I mean, I've heard of times where they didn't want you stopping at bars or like hanging out. Passing through is one thing, but like, don't be stopping and hanging out places. I've heard of that before for sure. But honestly, if it was that type of relationship where you thought they were going to tell you no, that might not be something we'll be checking in with anyways, because you don't really want to give them a heads up where you're going to be. So it's kind of up to the club's relationships. If it's a club that's in that area and they're dominant and you're good friends with them, then we would definitely let them know. If it was a club that we were at odds with, we might not.
Yeah, you just speed right through, right?
yeah, pretty much.
Now, once you get your patch, you're up there in Oregon. Did you have any dealings with your opposition, the rival clubs?
Not yet. At the time, the Vagos didn't have a ton of rival clubs. They were just starting to get into it with the Hells Angels in Northern California. So, there was quite a bit of that going on, but it was when I was in Reno and when I was in Oregon, but it was traveling back and forth. Like I'd have to travel to Sacramento to support the chapters that were there, or travel to Redding and try and support the chapters there. But where I physically lived, it wasn't really an issue. I think the biggest thing is the dominant clubs that were there, the Gypsy Jokers and Free Souls, Brother Speed, Outsiders, they were concerned that we were there to start a chapter, which at the time we weren't. So they were keeping a pretty heavy eye on us, but we had the Vagos had a pretty good established relationship with those clubs because they'd been in Oregon for so long. So that was more of they were keeping an eye on where, us kind of encroaching on their area and making sure we weren't, setting up shop in their backyard.
So looking back now, did you sense that they were putting informants in the club, and did you get information after that they did? And can you explain a situation where maybe they did put a...
Yeah, they definitely did. But, I was really naive to that situation. I was a young kid in my mid-20s. I didn't know much about that lifestyle yet. From what I knew, we weren't doing anything illegal, outside of defending ourselves or maybe some recreational drug use. There really was no grand conspiracy or no criminal organization. So to me, I couldn't comprehend why law enforcement would care anyways. And then, from movies and books and stuff, all I knew about was undercover agents. I didn't even know what a confidential informant was. I didn't really know that was a thing. I mean, I knew that people would get caught and tell on people, but I didn't realize that they would intentionally plant these guys into chapters or and then get paid to make up stories and tell on people. So I was pretty naive to it. So I definitely ignored a lot of red flags on the first few guys that were coming around, and they'd asked a lot of questions, and, they just did some pretty shady stuff that looking back made some sense. But like I said, I didn't know enough about it. So, honestly, they got what they wanted out of the fact that they had, guys hanging out, asking questions. And, I think all they were figuring out was how many members there were, what our intentions were, stuff like that, because we weren't doing illegal stuff. So I can't imagine there was too much information to give, but it definitely happened for sure.
What was your first dealings with the police once you came back to Oregon, when you had the patch with the Vagos? And how long were you a Vago for?
I was a Vago for 2 years before I switched over to the Mongols, and I was a year in Reno and a year in Oregon, or Carson City, Nevada, right outside of Reno. It wasn't long before getting back into Oregon where I started getting pulled over a lot and, because I said they weren't used to that patch up there. They were kind of wondering what we were doing, who we were there with. The actual first time I got pulled over, I was out riding with my dad. First time we'd ever ridden motorcycles together. And I was in my patch and he was on my brother's bike, and we were out riding around and we got pulled over. And they initially said it was because he didn't have a motorcycle endorsement. But it turned out the cop that pulled us over used to be a corrections officer where my dad went to prison. So he knew my dad right out the gate from prison. So, I'm picking on my dad like, this is your fault. And then the next cop that pulls up was the old school resource officer from my high school that was now a gang cop. So the two cops knew both of us, me and my dad, pretty well. So they ended up impounding his bike, and it turned into quite the ordeal. So that was my first big, first real experience with law enforcement while wearing a patch.
And then did it continued? Like you would get harassed a lot by them?
Yeah, and I mean, looking back, there was some specific law enforcement officers, whether it was local or ATF or federal guys, that were in charge of the motorcycle clubs in that area. So it kind of followed me from Vagos to Mongols. It was the same guys. The same guys would, if we were at a bar with a bunch of us, those would be the guys coming by. Those were the guys paying for the informants. They were the ones asking around. It was always kind of the same ones that were harassing us. And that ended up being the two that, I got arrested for following down the road, where they said I tried to kidnap them, that whole criminal case I had there. So it ended up being the same two for quite a while. And even after that case, I got found not guilty, but I got put on probation for the misdemeanors. And even then they were trying to get me busted all the time and thrown back in jail. And it was a pretty long running thing. In fact, even once I moved out here to Illinois, law enforcement and the outlaw biker investigators unit kind of goes everywhere. And even out here, they tried to harass, but it was all based off these guys from Oregon initially.
Would follow you there, right?
Yeah, or they would tell the gang cops out here, hey, this is where he works. And then they would call my work and try and get me fired, or, just stupid stuff like that.
So what was your first experience once you're a Vago? What was your first experience with violence around you? Whether it was another club member or you were involved with a altercation, what was your first experience?
There wasn't a ton, because the fact that, I came from a pretty violent subculture already, and I was really wanting to prove myself. So I was almost looking for some of those situations. I'm a young, naive kid. I'm not saying that it's cool now by any means, but that, that was where my mindset was back then. And we got into it. There's a funny story I talk about in my book where we get into it with a club called the Over the Hill Club. But I didn't know who they were. They came in and they were bullying around, pushing everybody and trying to act all tough. So started fighting with them, and then I realized the patch on their back said Over the Hill. They're a bunch of old men. But stuff like that. And then it started, I talk about this in my book a bit too, but there was an old agreement in Reno between the Vagos and the Hells Angels that there was a club called the Renegades. That this was before I was in the club, but they had an agreement existed that the Renegades wouldn't be allowed back in Reno. And the Hells Angels reestablished the Renegades in Reno. And so then things started getting pretty tense. And so that's when things started to get pretty serious in that world. And that was kind of my first big taste of, we went from hanging out, riding motorcycles, having fun to, having to watch ourselves around Hells Angels. So that escalated pretty quickly.
Yeah. Are some of your people getting caught by them at different places? And then you're driving around, you have a patch on your back. So it's kind of like you have a target, right?
Right. And you know what? Not yet, because this was more of a Cold War. Everyone was still feeling everything out. I don't think either side was really wanted it yet. We're both kind of, there were still negotiations and talks going on. But once we established a chapter in Reading, they started attacking our guys in Reading, and then that started going to tit for tat and back and forth. So it ended up happening eventually, but initially it was more of waiting to see what was going to happen, and it's more that kind of tense situations.